the reality is that we're reaching a point now where the accumulation of information is important.
And should we be thinking about sustainability as a technology? Is that a useful thing to do?
So that's exactly where I was heading, and that is to say that just as a phone is a technology, an idea is a technology, and an idea implemented is a technology. And so sustainability is going through the same evolutionary pathway that we did, moving from landlines to a mobile device to make phone calls, to a mobile device that was a smartphone and it was more capable of doing many things. In the same way, sustainability is going through that same evolution as a technology set that we make use of to understand and better improve the management of our planet, the management of our businesses, and the management of society.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Tartan Ties. This is our Old Scotch Collegians podcast, in which we try and find the most interesting people that we can find who've been Old Scotch alumni and associated with the school, and have some interesting wide-ranging chats with them. And tonight we're really happy to have Ray Wills with us. Let me read some of this because there's a lot of large words in here which take a bit to digest, but Professor Ray Wills has a wide-ranging career as a researcher, academic, planner, consultant, advisor, manager, executive and futurist. Futurist is something that we'll really hoe into a little bit because that's a lot of fun talking about. Ray left Scotch College in 1978 and he was a Stuart House boy. We'll talk a little bit about how that influenced you, or if it even influenced you, or if retrospectively you think it might have influenced you. Ray has a business in Perth and deals as an advisor on sustainability, technology and futurism in the built environment, in clean tech, in energy infrastructure, industrials, manufacturing, resources, transport and water. And he's an adjunct professor of what's now called the School of Earth and Environment. Is that right still?
Agriculture and Environment now.
Agriculture and Environment, which used to be called?
Geography.
Yeah. So there you are. We got a couple of the Year 9 philosophy class to ask some questions, and they're pretty gentle, but it's a nice way to lead in. The first bullet point, the first question from the boys was, what is your proudest achievement?
Oh, look, without doubt, my proudest achievement is being a father. Although that might be usurped by the fact that I'm now a grandfather. I had much less to do with that, but that's also a proud achievement. But certainly being a parent is the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. But for the benefit of the Year 9 philosophy students, I think that probably one of the single events that I've been in career-wise has been as the CEO of the Sustainable Energy Association of Australia, and in leading that group we created a great deal of change through the early part of last decade, and I think the knowing a lot about what has gone before was really pivotal in doing that. So leading that team of people who were just exceptional was really a very proud moment as well.
That'll cover it from both angles. Obviously, the parental thing is overwhelming, but when you're in Year 9,
you don't appreciate what it will be like to be a dad or a mum.
Yeah, we were chatting before, and I showed you the front page of the Reporter from 1978. It was the year of consolidation. That's a really uninspiring kind of tagline for a year. I'm not sure quite why that was. Does that mean anything to you?
No, I was actually a writer in the Reporter.
Yep.
And so I would have had a few articles in there. But I don't think I was politically aware, and I don't think I was linguistically aware enough at that point. So I'm not sure what a year of consolidation was actually meant to mean, rather than that's what we were doing.
Consolidate. Yeah. We've got you in Stuart House. We've got you in the Resource Centre. I don't think it's called the Resource Centre anymore. I think we've gone back to calling them libraries, actually.
We have, yes. No, there was a remarkable innovation of wordage and verbiage. So we added a few words in the Resource Centre. That was the Bunning Resource Centre, was
that's
it?
right.
Yeah, the Bunning Resource Centre, of course it was. And yes, I spent a lot of time in there because I was, basically just a geek and a nerd that really liked books and liked information. And today that's still true.
Just different formats,
Yeah.
same old formats probably.
Yeah,
as well.
I'm much more digital now. I rarely write on a piece of paper, and that's probably just as well because my handwriting is very much that of a doctor. And yeah.
We've got you in forum as well, and it sort of leads a little bit into something that would be interesting to chat about. Forum was obviously something which maybe our generation understands but doesn't exist anymore, but it was part of a set of communication networks in the school. Forum and Newsboard were current affairs kind of communications setups.
I remember the forum stuff, and I guess again, probably for me, formatively, in terms of the way that I thought, I probably didn't understand forum that well, to be frank, but I participated, and it seemed to be a good thing to do, and they were seeking the opinion of students on the operation of the school, so it was a good chance for feedback, but I was developmentally probably, socially developmentally is probably a little bit behind others, mostly because of my fascination with books, which didn't hurt me. I'm okay now, but at the time,
better.
yeah, that's it.
The question number 2 from the philosophers was, what do you value most about your time at Scotch, and perhaps as well, what pathways did you take while you were here?
Look, I think probably in the end the diversity of experience, because I wasn't a particularly social boy. I think that I got to socialise more than I might have if I was on my own. Not that can happen to a teenager in a school system. But I also surprised myself by engaging in what was Army Cadets back in the day. I became a communications corporal. I was involved in Alpha Bravo Charlie, learning the old language of radio communications, and getting out with Pak Roberts, who was the Indonesian teacher, which I took Indonesian, but also happened to be an ex-SAS officer, and was therefore part of the Army Reserves. And that was a stage when Army Reserves and cadets, air cadets, had been actually reduced by the current government. And so it was interesting seeing that really done in a private enterprise way. Now that I think about it, we just did it ourselves instead of actually having full support from a formal network from the Defence Forces. That was quite a radical change for me, because at the end of the day, I think that when I was 6, I was hugging trees and counting dinosaurs, and I'm not that much different now that I'm tenfold that number. And so I guess the view of how the Defence Forces interplays in our society is something that I reflect on these days.
Yeah. We don't have an active cadet unit anymore at school, but they're still around in that sense, and there are cadet enterprises that schools and surf clubs and everybody else subscribe to. They still serve that function, I guess. Yeah.
And you're just causing me to remember which not unhappy memories. I was also in the chess club. There's a surprise for a geeky young man. And I was also in the Japanese club, because we didn't have Japanese language as an option. We had Italian, we had French, we had Indonesian, I think. Indonesian and French certainly, because I was taking both of those. And I was always very interested in languages.
So there's a couple of themes developing, because you clearly have ended up relatively strongly in the science camp. You wanted, however, to go off to film school.
Yeah. So while my best performance academically was in the biological sciences, and certainly I was top of the rankings in school for biology and so on, and not for chemistry or physics, because I didn't like those. But yeah, my vision as a young lad was to go off and make documentaries about wildlife. But it won't mean anything to younger listeners, but Harry Butler turned up on the scene while I was mid-school, and he taught me 2 things. One is he'd already done the thing on wildlife documentaries, Wills, so move on. But the second thing was that he knew a lot about the subject that he was filming and talking about. And so as a consequence of that, I thought, well, if I'm going to ever make wildlife documentaries, I'd best learn about the biology of the system more than just a high school biology degree. Learnings might teach me, so I moved on to that. And so therefore I enrolled in botany, geography and zoology and chemistry at UWA. The chemistry only because I had to, because it was part of the degree. The others because that's really what I wanted to do.
And what got its hooks into you? Was it some specific things, or was it just that general interest and curiosity, is a word we've used talking to each other, or about what's underneath all of this and how much more can I find out?
Gosh, yeah. Look, it again brings back a memory. When I was looking at all my subject matters in moving on to second year at university, I met with Professor McComb. Arthur told me at the time, Wills, you're interested in zoology and geography, but you'll find that botany is the best basis of science. And he was right in the end, because that's where I did my honours degree and that's where I did my PhD as a botanist and as an ecologist, but from the botany department that was of the time in UWA.
And where were you with your PhD? You're still a young bloke. Was that where you started looking at bees and ecosystems and the southwest of WA and that kind of environmental stuff? Yeah,
look, all of that biology days. I did my honours in mycology, studying fungi coming up after bushfires. Okay. So it was an ecology degree while it was still a mycology degree, and I threw in a bit of genetics because I liked the genetics toys and one of the girls that worked in the genetics lab, so that worked as well. And then I went on to do my PhD, and it was a bursary from the Honey Research Council of Australia to look at honeybee use of vegetation, and that was in 1984. And as I started that research, there was a new fancy thing called Landsat, which was a satellite that launched first in 1979 that collected hyperspectral images of the Earth. And being a geek, I thought, well, that sounds pretty cool. How do I classify vegetation, and can I use that? So in 1985, I had 3 data sets from 79, which was pretty poor, from 81, and then from 83, which then started to inform my PhD work. And at the same time, there was all these remarkable gizmos coming up in computing science, and a special thing that had just been developed called a relational database, and an even more special thing using relational databases called a geographic information system. And so in 1985, I started to introduce GIS analysis and spatial data analysis into my PhD. And really, what I just realised now is that I was just a geek playing with toys, but I thought I was deploying the latest technology on cutting edge science to do wonderful work on honeybees. And indeed, I was. But the reality was that I was collecting what we called back then large data sets that these days, fit on a floppy drive that no longer exist, but they were big data sets. And prior to the invention of relational databases, I was cutting my own code in C to write relational databases to handle the data that I was collecting, which was quickly supplanted by the arrival of Macintosh in 1984. That's how old I am. And also the arrival of the relational databases on Macintosh, which didn't happen until 85, and those databases came out as commercial software.
Crikey, there's a lot of detail in there, and I don't say that disparagingly, because one of the things that puts you where you are now is your ability to be that person that juggles both the high level and the detail, and makes the detail digestible and understandable, and, for instance, strategic to clients and to organisations, to West Australian mining companies and energy companies, etc., etc. I'm guessing as well that you're beginning at that earliest point to form some ideas about sustainability, which obviously has developed into an entirety of an industry now. How did you and how do we now think about sustainability as one of the ways that can help us into the big conversation which everybody's having about looking after ourselves and looking after and mending our climate?
Look, I think probably the primary thing I've learned is that everything is a technology, whether it's a hard idea like a smartphone, evolving from a cell phone, evolving from a a mobile device that made phone calls, and these days a smartphone it's a banking system, it's a networking system, it's a social system. Oh, and by the way, you can make a phone call on it. That's one of the extra things you can do. Whereas back in the day, a phone was just a phone. On top of that, I guess expanding to these additional technologies, what we've seen is step changes in our ability to accumulate information, and the reality is that we're reaching a point now where the accumulation of information is important.
And should we be thinking about sustainability as a technology? Is that a useful thing to do?
So that's exactly where I was heading, and that is to say that just as a phone is a technology, an idea is a technology, and an idea implemented is a technology. And so sustainability is going through the same evolutionary pathway that we did, moving from landlines to a mobile device to make phone calls, to a mobile device that was a smartphone, and it was more capable of doing many things. In the same way, sustainability is going through that same evolution as a technology set that we make use of to understand and better improve the management of our planet, the management of our businesses, and the management of society. And so we actually move into sustainability, gaining additional skill sets, gaining additional layers of complexity, and as we move forward in that, gaining also levels of acceptance that we didn't have before. And so there's a thing called Rogers S-curve, which defines or describes the way that technology enters an economy, enters a culture, and that Rogers S-curve is, not surprisingly, shaped like an S. It starts at a low level, it goes up like an S, and it comes to a peak where you get saturation of market penetration associated with the S-curve. If we're sitting in this room at the moment and there's a few spare seats on the wall, then in that sense, in Rogers S-curve, we're on an early part of the curve because there's more seats to fill. But if there were more people around on the podcast and all the seats were full around the theatre, we'd be at the top end of the curve. We'd be accommodating the technology of the curve. And sustainability is kind of halfway up the curve. It's starting to fill some of the seats, but not all of the seats. But actually, some of those seats have already been booked by players like Apple, who are looking at complex ideas like how do we actually be a better custodian of our supply chain and our product? How do we actually appreciate that not only do we want to be a better business not harming the planet, but we want to make sure that the businesses that are supplying us are not harming the planet. So therefore we start to talk about greening the supply chain, greening the steps along the supply chain, making sure all of our suppliers upstream to our product are delivering us a better product, a greener product, a less harmful product, and reaching a point where Apple now powers around the world all of its operations from renewable energy. It's a goal that they achieved last year.
And it gives you that framework as well to think about how all of those things have to go up that S-curve at a relatively closely together, because environmental scientists have been near the top and understanding for 40, 50 more years the problems associated with pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, and Margaret Thatcher was talking as a Conservative politician to the UN in 1980 something early. And yet that
famous left-wing greenie, yes,
exactly. Yeah. But culture and society and economics haven't come up that curve quickly enough for us to have acted. That's an interesting insight. I mean, I think in some ways the first of the sustainability practitioners were the early innovators. So on Rogers S-curve, they occupied that space, and they had to convince others to join them. And that's what builds up the marketplace of Rogers S-curve. And so in that same framework, we can actually see the way that it also describes that the success of a technology, whether it's a TV set or a solar panel or a smartphone or a sustainability concept, the success of that concept needs to be able to make the journey, and sometimes it won't complete the journey if those other synergies aren't there, if those other complementarities aren't there, if you can't get the additionality that's provided by multiple convergence of events. And so some people call that good fortune.
If you're adept enough, it'd be good planning. I think the truth sits somewhere in the middle.
And we've evolved all of these now, hopefully, on the way out. Fossil fuel technologies incredibly quickly. We've become reliant on them incredibly quickly. We've been almost on any basis of measurement successful, and are now a victim of our own success and trying to reverse that and do it more quickly than we actually evolved the technology in the first place. So we've sort of got to backpedal or side pedal or forward pedal, however you want to metaphorically look at it.
Yeah, even with the deployment of fossil fuels, the deployment of coal still followed Rogers' S-curve. We started using coal initially 300 years ago, but its rapid deployment started with the Industrial Revolution, and so it had a fairly good acceleration after that point. But then we learnt of better ways to use coal, from basic steam engines to complicated steam engines. And then we went through the same thing with other fossil fuels like oil. The first commercial oil wells were 150 years ago, but our real active use of them started in the 1910s and the 1920s, once we actually created a device that would consume them, which was Ford and his Model T, and capturing the technology of the marketplace that was motor cars at the time. And so that rapid acceleration of oil, really down to the juxtaposition, the coincidence of the technology that could make use of it. Did the oil come first or the car come first? Well, actually, the oil came first, but very rapidly the car followed to make use of the innovation that was an oil well. Yeah. And while we can recognise today the unsustainability of that, the reality is we can recognise the technological advancement that created it and the opportunities that were created as a consequence in rapid diversification of industrialisation.
Although really, just as a quip, I guess, but Mr. Mercedes developed an electric car before anybody developed, the internal combustion engine, and VHS Betamax just one beat the other out, probably because of the economics, probably because of the ability to pump oil into these cars cheaply for the consumer.
And the economics and also the technology of the time, so it was lead-acid batteries rather than lithium batteries, so we were also restricted on range. Electric cars of the day had a good range of 30 or 40 miles, which was good enough for the day until somebody worked out that, well, actually, if we've got a petrol tank, we can go further. Now, lithium batteries and electric vehicle is now resetting the clock on what is an expected range of a vehicle. But even through the 70s, when fuel efficiency was notoriously bad and we hit the oil crisis, the average range of a petrol car was only 250 mile. And it was only through energy efficiency standards, the CAFE standards that were created at the time, so-called CAFE standards, that created an energy efficiency rating for a motor vehicle, that we started to step up the energy efficiency of cars, and so therefore started to move the dial down in terms of oil consumption. But we built more cars as a consequence, and at the same time we made cars heavier, which reduced their fuel efficiency. Perversely, as we were increasing the engine fuel efficiency, the overall vehicle was heavier, so therefore you needed more energy to move a heavier vehicle.
Yeah. I want to come back to cars, but the theme of and the real dilemma that I think is interesting, even from you're thinking about what am I going to do when I leave school, the importance of communications, the importance of actually not just being the scientist, knowing the science, developing the science, which can be done and has been astonishingly well done, but the ability for scientists to communicate with people and bring them along has, in some of these areas failed really badly, which is why, we can't pat ourselves on the back and say, well, Mrs. Thatcher made a good speech. I just saw it again. It was 1989, and she said, we must use science to cast a light ahead. And she said, it's no good squabbling about who's responsible or who's going to pay. We have to look forward, not backwards, and we'll only succeed in dealing with the problems through a vast international cooperative effort. To me, that speaks of needing great communication. And part of your kit bag is that you've been the top 100 global leaders in sustainability. You've also, at the same time, are top 100 global influencers in social media. So tell us a little bit about the importance of getting out there and advocating in a way that people can understand without necessarily needing to dumb it down. You know, I think people want to be brought along. They want to feel like they're part of this pathway. They don't want to be alienated by it.
What a complicated question.
Yeah.
But fabulous. So, you know, just reflecting on Thatcher, and so she was commenting at the time after the formation of the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in 1988, and that was just reflecting on Britain's then commitment to actually fund that program and to fund part of that UN program to actually understand the science. It was also at the time when Reagan was president. It was also at the time when we were seeing the first of the lobbyists particularly become effective against changes in the science and against accepting that from the oil lobby. I reflect on the fact that one of my interests has always been language and the culture that language creates. And that culture can be endemic within a science, so that you use terms within science that are isolating from anybody else that's not in that science. So you use terms that you can use GDP as an economist, or you can use endemic species as a biologist, and people going, what the hell are you talking about? So you isolate because of a culture. I guess one of the real privileges I've had, and it has been a privilege, is to work across industries. And because I've worked across industries, I've learnt the languages of each industry. And so when somebody is talking to me about, oh yeah, it's about GDP, Ray, I can go, yeah, okay, but don't forget these biodiversity principles that are tied to the very well-being of the planet and how that relates. How do you weave that all together in a conversation? And the answer is you've got to keep the language simple. Not simple in a insulting sense, but simple in the sense that they're common words that we share.
Accessible.
And absolutely, are accessible across different cultures and across different industries and across different language groups, all of the above. And so therefore you can actually communicate. The problem for science had initially was that back in the day we thought institutions were to be respected. And science institutions were, up until that day, because of NASA, because of space launches and moon launches, institutions of science were actually used to being respected for the facts that they delivered. And there was an expectation from the science community that all we had to do was deliver the facts, and everybody would rationally conclude, here are the facts, this is what we need to do. And what they weren't used to dealing with was lobby groups who were interested in perverting the facts and actually providing a different narrative, which seemed on the face of it very plausible, except the Earth is not flat. And so, there were proponents out there that were, in a sense, saying the Earth is flat, climate change can't be real, and everybody said, oh, I didn't know the Earth was flat, and they were distracted by that conversation. So it's only a part answer to your question, because your question was complicated, but I think that that our ability to deliver that language was in part hampered by the fact that we thought science thought it was respected, and it was becoming not so, as were many other institutions of the day, as lobbyists were actually looking at disenfranchising people from science, and that continues today. But fortunately, we seem to be on a downward curve of that problem. But in additional to that is we were seeing the further addition of what seemed at the day complicated concepts. Sustainability was a word that we'd used for businesses, but we'd never used it for the environment before. And suddenly we were taking this new language into a new sector and expecting people to understand what we were saying. I used to be, as an ecologist, I used to think, ecologists are really cute because, we've got these phrases called diversity and endemic species and niche and competition theory. And it wasn't until I was in my late 30s, middle of my career, that I discovered that actually Charles Darwin used the language of the economists of the day. He didn't invent those words. They were already invented. They were being used by economists, and he'd translated them into ecosystems. Now, ironically, I find that, I'll go on a bit of a side rant here and stop very quickly. Ironically, I find that that because of the work of ecology, we now understand really well competition theory and niche and diversity and how those things work in an ecosystem. And it's lessons that we can actually translate back, ironically, to the economy. However, we've not had the opportunity yet for our ecological scientists to actually take a concept back to the economists and say, guys, this is what we've done. Why is that? Because experimental science works by, if I want to work on how actively do honeybees forage on a flower, then I get a set of flowers with nectar in it, and I get another set of flowers, and I take the nectar out, and I see how the honeybees work. And so you get this competition
and
theory,
test it in a scientific
and you
way,
can test it. But if I was wandering into a bar and I took the wallets off of students that were drinking there, and see how they then buy their next round of drinks, I'd get arrested. So what we actually had to wait for in economic theory was experimental economics to arrive. And experimental economics, interestingly, was activated by computer systems. So what a Nobel Prize-winning scientist called Norm Smith did was he did take the wallets of students, but he did it in a computer lab. And he said, you've got $20, you've got $20, you've only got 10. And let's see how you all interact. And he developed a theory of economic trading.
And it's also that I think evolution from a raw, I'm not going to express this very well, principle in economics that, firstly, two things probably, that resources have always been infinite. So let's not even build that into the equation, let alone how do we value the free ones like wind and
fresh
sun.
air, fresh water.
And why should we? Why should we even build that into the whole equation? There's no need to do that. We can carry on regardless, down the street. But conversely, economics also says I will act in my own self-interest every time, and it's certainly not in my own self-interest to act the way I've acted in the last 5 decades. So how do those things sort of act? It's the need to evolve economics as well, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately, anything that doesn't change stagnates. All ideas will stagnate in time and become less useful. A bit like Rogers' S-curve, if we're all using the same ideas at the top of the S-curve, we're all doing the same thing. So, you've got to constantly innovate, and I'll stop hitting the microphone now. You've got to constantly innovate and not talk with your hands so you don't hit the microwave at the microphone. And I think relatively we've got to drive innovation, but a bit like humans getting a concept of non-linear growth, which we're really useless at, we're also fairly useless at managing innovation and creating the environment for innovation to happen continuously.
Well, let's take that into one of the other areas that you've talked really passionately about, which is education, and perhaps how was education in 1978? What should drive? What should we be really consciously driving into our education systems to allow innovation, creativity, free thinking, let alone free education itself?
Yeah, look, I think certainly science and research and development needs to be much more curiosity-led. We come up with ideas because we're curious. We're curious because we're human. The reason we climbed out of the trees in the first place is because we were human, and we thought, well, I wonder what it's like on the ground. Off we go. We're on an innovation adventure. And so in the same way, we need to be able to foster that, and the best way to foster it is to not constrain it. Your innovation is not about how do we make a better wire. Your innovation is how do we better communicate. And should that be through a wire? Should it be through the air? We wouldn't have Bluetooth if we still had wires, kind of thing. And so we need to free up that thinking to be able to deliver that innovation. In the education system, we talk about either this idea of a curiosity-led research and curiosity-led education, or do we have a vocationally focused education, one that says your interest is working in business, therefore you have a business degree, therefore your business degree looks like this, therefore these are the units of your education, these are the units study, and in doing so, that actually fits a lot of people. That's okay. We can have people that do say, look, I'm just interested in the vocation. I don't want to do this other stuff. I don't see the point of pursuing something that's how do you watch, how do you actually understand why crickets mate and how they mate and how do they find one another. I'd rather just make a list of where are the next gold mines and how can we make use of them. And that's okay.
But tell that story about the crickets mating and how that randomly led to other other innovation.
There was a professor in my zoology department, that Wynne Bailey, that was looking at the mating behaviour of tetagoniid crickets, and one problem that he's trying to solve is they mate at night time. How do they find one another? It's really dark. So to find this out, he started to engage with a physicist who started to come up with some principles about the auditory function of the hearing, the hearing organs that they had on their legs, the auditory organs, and so then they put some physics to it, and as a result of that, the basis of that science went on to contribute to the invention of the cochlear hearing aid. Now, they were only setting out to find out how these crickets find one another in the dark. It was curiosity-led research, but the outcome is better hearing for a whole heap of humans. And if you had have just said to them, we need a device for humans to hear better, they would not have come up with the device they did. So that curiosity-led research really did fundamentally spark a revolution in hearing aid technology. That's true in any brand of science. It's true in any brand of research. And how do we actually harvest that? We do need targeted research that says, how do we improve the efficiency of this widget? The widget looks like this. We want to make the widget a bit more efficiently. Can we just do that? And the answer is yes, we can. But the other side of curiosity-led research is, do we even need a widget? Should there be a widget? Should the widget look completely different? And the vocational-led research doesn't actually ask those questions.
And the same individual can have those, right side, left side conversations with themselves as well, of course. And you'll never find probably the executive who sits down and says, don't ever talk to me about anything except numbers because I've got the word numbers on my door. I love music, I love horse riding, I love surfing, I'm interested in documentaries, da-da-da. It's perhaps breaking down the silos between those things, both in your own head but also amongst individuals who socially interact. And I guess that comes to, as we were chatting about just off air before this, the workplace and people being a social species, and all of these things, science and technology and economics, are social constructs.
Yeah, I talked about, my wife was, who is a consummate project manager and leads, tens of $1 million projects to roll out new technology into workplaces. But she also loves her craft and she loves her artwork. And we were redecorating the house, and she said, can you see this shade of green in this blue colour I've got here and this shade of blue in this green colour I've got here? And I said, no, I can't. They both look green to me. I can't see the colour. But she can discern the difference. And when we redecorated the house, geez, it looked magic. I wouldn't have even imagined it. That's the kind of thing that diversity brings, because you've got people in the same group offering different views as to how things work. And what you have to ensure is that the people that have the best talent in that particular group are the ones you allow to prosecute it. And you might have some governors in terms of budget management, and you might have some governors in terms of governance of the project and that kind of thing, but you actually put your best people on it. Steve Jobs said, I don't hire smart people so I can tell them what to do. I hire smart people so that they can tell me what to do. And that's really the fundamental lesson.
Yeah. Turn the pyramid upside down.
Yeah.
Let's have a little chat about your style as a futurist. And I know you have said to me you're optimistic. So in amongst all of this talk about how hard it is to move the dial in terms of climate change and action, What are you optimistic about, and what is the future in Perth? Let's get local. Talk about what West Australia and our amazing industries, our extractive industries, and our skills, our incredible engineers, etc. How do we deploy ourselves to take advantage of all of that?
So we've got another 4.5 hours in this.
Yeah,
cool.
easy.
Okay. Look, I think first off is that the opportunities in Western Australia are extraordinary. The threats in Western Australia are extraordinary. So if we just think on the pessimistic side about climate change for a minute, what does 1 degree of warming mean to Perth? If it was 1 degree warmer today, people would have gone, yeah, it was pretty cool. It was a better day than it would have been if it was 1 degree cooler. So, what's wrong with the warming? And the answer is we're not talking about the warmth of a day. We're talking about the warmth of a planet. And when you actually convert that into thermal mass, and when you start to look at the numbers of what that means, when you warm a planet by 1 degree, you do really, really interesting things to climate belts. The pole
in climate belts are areas that go around.
Yeah, so the
globe.
the tropics and the temperate zones and the Arctic zones and the Antarctic zones are the other way around. So when you warm a planet, you push the temperatures push out from the equator. If we just focus on our area, in a temperate zone, if you warm a temperate zone by 1 degree, you move a climate belt by about 150 kilometres. Up to 300 k's, but 150 to 300 k's, let's just go with a conservative number, 150. If we warmed Perth's climate by 2 degrees in a year, then Perth's climate actually shifts southwards, because it's being pushed away from the equator, southwards 300 kilometres. So that means Perth's temperature is down around Busselton. Okay, down around Busselton we've got this thing called a carry forest. And if you move the carry forest, consequently, also 300 kilometres south, it's now in the Southern Ocean. Carry trees don't grow in the Southern Ocean. Actually, Margaret River vineyards don't grow in the Southern Ocean. When we talk about warming our continent and the Perth climate zone by 2 degrees, we're actually talking about shifting everything south 300 k's. Geraldton is basically almost all the way down to Perth. That's the temperature. Perth is down almost down to Busselton. That's the temperature. And Busselton is now off the map into the Southern Ocean. And Margaret River and Pemberton and going across, and Albany's gone. All of those temperate zones are gone. So that's pretty substantial. Why am I optimistic? Let's keep this in less than 4.5 hours. Because our ability to change is there. We are already globally on a track to move from electricity that's produced by fossil fuels to electricity that's produced by renewable energy. How soon can that happen? Well, actually, based on my analytics with my technology models, by 2030, the world should be 80% renewable for generation of electricity. Right now, it's about 40%. That seems to be a very steep hill, but actually, that's because 10 years ago it was only 10%. We're going up that trajectory very fast, and we'll get to the destination very quickly. Could we get to 100% renewables by 2030? Well, yes, we could. If we put ourselves on, there's different analogies, onto a moonshot setting or onto a war setting, where we actually said technologically, globally, economically, this is where we're going. And we're going to prioritise all of our resources to ensure that we get there, and our target is 2030. We can do it. Have we done that? No, we haven't. Am I optimistic that we can actually change in the next year or two based on the Ukrainian-Russian war and the illegal invasion of Russia in Ukraine, the oil and gas shortages that are created as a consequence of it, the threat of food shortages and famines as a consequence of the disruption of the global supply chain of food from the basket that is the food basket that is Ukraine and Russia. All of those things are going to disrupt us big time. However, that's a pretty pessimistic way to introduce why I'm optimistic. But what it's done is it's galvanised responses. And so we're seeing in Europe, albeit that one or two players are acting more slowly, we're seeing in Europe, let's get off of gas. Let's actually push forward on our renewables. Let's finally do this moonshot that will be a renewable energy target. So it won't make a difference in the next 12 months, don't get me wrong, but it will make a difference in the next 2 years. And if the momentum that's gained as a consequence of that, like any learning curve that is always non-linear, it's always a rapid growth curve, we can actually achieve great changes in the matter of 2 to 5 years, which means that 8 years away that's a walk in the park. It's easy. It's doable.
So quite often you've got to have shock to catalyse something, because clearly pure science hasn't catalysed quite enough, and then you can change policy settings, and then you can creep up as quickly as you can into a sprint to chase those aims.
Yeah, look, I mean, in 2007 and 2008, when I was first being interviewed on these topics of climate change and what are the impacts, I was commentating on behalf of the University of Western Australia, and people were saying, well, what's coming? And I was saying, well, sea level rise. We're going to see the Swan River break its banks. We're going to see beaches start to erode and see coastal erosion setback. And we're going to see storm events that come in more intensely because they're the three key factors that we're going to see. In the interim, what's happened? The seawalls of the Swan River have been raised. We've seen flooding on the freeway, on the Mitchell Freeway, the Kwinana Freeway, as a consequence of the river breaking its banks, not because there's been extra floods water in the river, but because of sea level rise. Has that been reported in the media as we responded and raised the banks of the Swan River because of sea level rise? No, it hasn't. It's just saying, oh yeah, we've got some floods on the Kwinana Freeway. We've seen erosion along Cottesloe Beach and many other places which have seen beaches become smaller than they used to be. And we've seen major rainfall events in Perth and around the world that's caused flood, and also the lack of major rainfall events causing droughts. And there have been global headlines for the last couple of years. In terms of Perth, this year is a great example. If I was in a room full of people and asked them to put their hands up saying, hasn't it been a wet year this year, who would agree with me? And you'd all throw your hands up, and I'd say, would you be surprised that the rainfall we've had this year is below the Perth average? It's been wet because all the other years have been so dry that suddenly this wet year seems to be a lot wetter than we're used to. And it is, because it's been so dry. The past few years have been record low rainfall events, which have led to record low streamfall events into Perth dams, and this is all data that's freely available, and we know that dams don't feel like they used to, which is why we've got desal plants. So, we've got the technology to actually stave off and adapt to some of this climate change, which is things like desal plants to provide water. And we've also got the technology to reduce our emissions. It's called renewable energy. And we've also got new technology coming on market which will help us manage the energy systems to ensure that we have energy security, energy resilience, and that's batteries, and that's coming to market now. And that's an integrated package. I'm optimistic because we actually have the technology at hand, and we're not waiting on the technology to arrive. The technology exists today.
And part of the research was looking at some of your stuff. You did a great report on value chain analysis on the lithium industry. So we've got the raw materials, and we've always known we've had the raw materials, and we've always been good at the raw materials. The trick, it's no secret, is to do something with them and do it here.
So there's two parts to that. One is I call Australia as the shopping basket of materials for anything to build a battery. There are 10 prime materials that you need in a battery, and I won't list them now, but the 10 primary materials, all of them are available in Australia. Some at lower supply than others, but lithium is in abundance. And so as a consequence, companies that are actually seeking to mine lithium are doing extraordinarily well. Lithium used to be a product that we used to colour glass. A green glass was a lithium glass. It was a colour in paint. It was a colour in different technologies. It was a medicine, but we didn't need much of it. Now that we're actually putting, and we used to build batteries, so we did need some lithium, and lithium batteries, we used to build those. Up until 2015, 2014, the largest single user of lithium batteries in the world were handheld gaming stations. more than mobile phones. We actually had more Game Boys and the like than we did have mobile phones at the time. And they were also bigger because they needed more battery life than a mobile phone. So we already were using that. We move on now, though, to the point where we've got all these materials. On top of that, I like to say that Australia is the Middle East of renewable energy, that Western Australia is the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. We've got so much of this resource that it's extraordinary that we're not harvesting more of it. Some would say, but our grid's only so big. Well, what if we did more with it? Let's say we start value adding to resources. Let's build some refineries that need to actually take energy to make lithium hydroxide, some of the base materials for batteries. Actually, let's move on to the next stage and let's start building battery cathodes and battery anodes and battery materials that are incorporated to make a battery cell. And that'll require more energy, and that can be renewable energy from Australia. And then we can actually value add to actually developing products, battery packs, battery factories to do that. All of that ability sits there, and those reports, which scarily mention, are from 2018, which say exactly that. We did a Lithium Valley report for the Regional Development Authority. We did the supply chain report for the Australian mining exploration companies. We did a further report for Austrade on export opportunities for lithium in Australia, and a couple of other adjunct reports that we did to that. 2018 was a remarkable year because everybody was interested and fascinated, except that the federal government of the day was less interested in clean tech.
Yeah, and I guess that's the thing. You need the confluence of things that are politics and society and business. So without the policy settings and the certainty from government, state and federal, business doesn't have certainty, even though it knows this stuff, because they're not dumb.
Yeah.
And I know you said one of your quotes was lithium royalties will be greater than gold royalties in a few years, and that was 2 or 3 years ago. You said that.
Yep.
And it's not far off.
They are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think they're the third largest royalty now. I'd have to check the numbers again. I haven't done it in the last 6 months, but certainly this year I'd expect that lithium royalties will probably peak past. Here's some for some that are familiar with this stuff. Past royalties for bauxite.
Yep.
For alumina.
Yeah. It's not just energy, and it's not just renewables in terms of solar and I think we probably have been quite tied up in our national and international conversations about energy replacement.
Yep.
Because of perhaps the influence of the various lobby groups and the passion on both sides. Bill Gates's book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, talks about some ways to get your head around what the size of the problem is. And there's 51 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases added to the atmosphere every year, if that's correct. We've got to take that to zero. It's not got to go to 45 or 23. It's got to go to zero. And his big question is, what are you going to do about cement? And that's quite an interesting way of framing the question. He says there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 main activities that produce greenhouse gases. There's making things, plugging in, growing things, getting around, and keeping warm or cool. And making things, cement, steel, plastic, is actually bigger than anything else, 31%. Give or take wherever he gets his stats from and how that works. Plugging in, which is the electricity, is just below that on 27%. So we can't just think that we're putting in substitute renewable power and problem solved.
So part of that is the transport equation.
Yep.
And so we can actually move the transport system from fossil fuels to electricity. It's happening now. Mm-hmm. The reality is that in my view, controversially, it'll be all over by 2026. Mm-hmm. It will be very evident that we've electrified most of the new vehicle sales by that time. And so that will then very quickly translate into replacement of fleet, which takes average age of fleet is 11 years. So therefore, with an accelerated replacement of fleet, which is likely because we'll have incentives to get cash for clunkers and to retire old fossil fuel driven vehicles, we'll probably see the fleet age reduce down as we more rapidly replace the fleet than in years gone by. Electrification of fleet, problem solved. In terms of industrial uses of carbon for making steel, we can do that with hydrogen. That's what's called green steel. And if we do make the hydrogen from renewable energy, we can pump it in to make steel instead of carbon. And so as a consequence, that's conversion of carbon. There's also electric processes that can then be used to make steel and a fertilizer and a whole range of other things. Industrial use of hydrogen today is a $170 billion industry. It's a big industry, 71 million tonnes a year. 96% of that comes from fossil fuels. So our ability to take Bill Gates' challenge of, a lot of what we do is in manufacturing, we need these carbon sources. Actually, no, we can translate them to hydrogen sources. Is it easier to do? Well, not that easy economically, because we actually have to bring the price of hydrogen down, not up, to satisfy the commercial equations in which we produce, or pay more for those products. Either pay more for the products or preferably get hydrogen production to be so cheap that we can replace it. In the built environment, there's a whole range of things that we can do in terms of the way that we use energy. And again, as a partly as a geographer, I think about these spatial questions of how do you move people about. The answer is public transit is critical. Getting people out of cars is critical. Getting people into electric mobility devices, whether that's an electric bicycle or whether that's an electric car. It can be an electric car, or whether that's some other simpler form of last mile movement is what we call it.
So it's not taking every single vehicle that's on the road now and tweaking it at the top of the curve and making it electric. It's also changing the entire dynamic. And one of your things is you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. Yeah. Change that dynamic and make how we solve A to B.
So when you see footage of a bike lane in the Netherlands, which Perth is in no danger of emulating, but what we know is that more people move down a bike lane that's 1.5 meters wide than move down a roadway that's 4 lanes wide. That's just extraordinary. And when you see people move down a bike lane in the Netherlands, you'll see that there's generally no blockages. They don't actually stop. Like it continue. Yeah, they're going at a slightly slower speed, or actually no, mostly they're going at a faster speed because the traffic is traffic and the traffic is congested, and it's just simply not moving, and it's waiting for the next traffic light cycle. Whereas the bikes are engineered to be able to move through those systems much more quickly. That's the big level example of a city with a dense population, and so therefore personal mobility devices like bicycles is much simpler, or whether there's electric scooters or whether they're even electric skateboards. We're seeing a lot of those really start to boom up now. And I'm not about to jump on an electric skateboard, but I might jump on an electric bike. Getting out of the car is the only way we can do that. Now, the other thing we can do with getting people out of the car is not to put them onto a bicycle, but to stick them into a bus. And like that bicycle lane, a single bus lane moves more people individually than 4 lanes of traffic. And that's just mind-blowing, but it's also something that we don't accept. And in Perth, of course, we revile against the fact that there's a bus lane because I can't drive down it. And it's just amazing to me to see in peak hour the number of 5-seater buses with one person in them going down a bus lane. It's a new definition of buses that we've invented in Perth.
We are exceptional. We do tell ourselves that our circumstances, our geography, it tends towards it being exceptional, and our built environments responded to that. Our sprawl.
Yeah, look, and it's also cultural matter. It was in the 60s that California started to remove trams on lobbying from the car industry, the 1960s. And as a consequence of that, town planners from cities around the world went to California, and town planners from California came to cities around the world, and they all said, oh, the car's the thing. And so we need to build freeways for cars because we've got to offer infrastructure for cars. And ironically, we did that in a really positive way. By building roads, we serviced the car culture, but it meant that the car culture flourished. How do we do the equivalent now for, say, electric cars? And the answer is we build charging infrastructure, which doesn't exist or which is now in minimal supply. So if we suddenly roll out car charging infrastructure for electric cars, then any range anxiety that might have existed 5 years ago, in 3 years' time, if we roll out this infrastructure, is simply blown away. You build the infrastructure for the circumstances that are fit for purpose. We had a view in the past that cars were the only way for us to move because that was the trendy thing. But in fact, reality, quality of life, cities are known to be more livable the fewer cars they have. The best cities in Europe, including Paris and including Berlin and Barcelona and Madrid, they all have large pedestrian malls with the absence of cars and the ability of people to walk and commute and sit and socialise and have a coffee that.
And we go and visit them, and we love it, and we think
do.
how sophisticated we are.
If only we could have this in Perth, we'd say. We can.
Tell us a little bit about your beef. You had a Twitter beef about the new Ferrari SUV for 390,000 pounds, V12 petrol.
Yeah.
Why are we doing that? Those of us who almost all of us are looking at changing our cars in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. What are we looking at? What are the tricks that car dealers are currently trying to foist on us?
Yeah, look, you've sparked a memory of a story that back in 2008, under Martin Ferguson, I'm pretty sure it was. It might have been still under Howard government, under McFarlane. The Australian government announced a program to assist the Australian car industry that still existed back then, and it was a car assistance to GM. And it was for GM to build an 8-cylinder Pontiac. And the 8-cylinder Pontiac was going to be an export-led recovery for the car industry, and we're going to send to the US, and it was going to be fabulous. And I'm pretty sure we spent something like $500 million on it, but I can't remember those metrics anymore. But, of course, at that time in 2008, it's the year after Al Gore released his Inconvenient Truth, and the whole world was heading down a trajectory of fuel efficiency. Australia announced its saviour was going to be a gas-guzzling G8 Pontiac to export to America for the current. It was just so crazy. What's the future look like? The future is almost already here. In fact, I often say that the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet, and that's stealing a quote from someone that but at the end of the day, electric cars are here and available. In Australia, there's not enough of them available. But this year, by the end of this year, Tesla will be the largest selling passenger vehicle in Australia. It will beat the Camry. If I'm wrong, I'm going to be wrong by about 1,000 units. Right. So it's a total of 17,000 cars that will reach at that point. The second highest selling car next year will be the Tesla Model 3, the current version. The highest selling car next year will be the Tesla Model Y. It might be beaten by the BYD Alto Model 3, which is also a fully electric car.
Which is also a brand that has come out of absolutely nowhere and hardly anyone knows about.
The fact that
mainstream.
That Warren Buffett was investing in 10% of the company back in 2015 is neither here nor there. The reality is that for the Australian market, this all seems very new because we didn't think we'd go electric that quickly. But as I mentioned in relation to GM, we no longer have a car industry. Australia doesn't build cars. So the only thing we do is buy the cars that the world makes. What if the world stopped making combustion engine cars? What sorts of cars could we buy? Well, they'd be electric. If the world stopped building combustion engine cars in 3 years, which is what I'm actually suggesting will happen, and some people think I'm a Fruit Loop and a little bit crazy, but yeah, that's okay. I'm prepared to live with that. If that's actually what happens, and even if it's in 2026 or 2027, I'll be mostly right. And the only thing at that point that Australia can buy will be electric cars. So the critical thing we have to do, again, is going back to infrastructure. We have to have car charging networks for electric cars in Australia so that won't be an inconvenience for anybody. And if we can do that, everything else follows suit.
And electric cars that are hybrid, that don't really plug into anything, that pretend sort of to be, that want to foot in both camps, seem to be, maybe they're part of the transition, but they're not really the future.
Again, because a combustion engine is a combustion engine, just because you attach it to a hybrid, it's still a combustion engine. The question is, will we be producing combustion engine cars, whether they're hybrid or not, in 2026? And my view is that the simplicity of an electric vehicle in terms of drivetrain, the fact that electric vehicles are a newer design vehicle, and from all of the test metrics, whether it be Eurocap standards or Australian ANCAP standards or safety standards around the world, these new cars that are being designed as electric cars also, interestingly enough, appear to be safer.
Oh, okay.
So we're not just gaining an electric drivetrain, we're gaining a safer car with an electric drivetrain that doesn't pollute the atmosphere, that actually plugs into an electricity network that can take renewable energy, that doesn't rely on imported fossil fuel. So we're impacting on the balance of trade, we're impacting on city health and atmospheric health, we're impacting on economic values, because there's no longer price spikes associated with the supply of energy to provide for the movement of the car. It wins not just on one metric, but on more than a half a dozen metrics.
And is it the not so secret Trojan horse for the rest of the problem? Because it seems, by my simplistic thinking, that actually the answers, as you say, the answers are out there or they're already here. It's the transition that is the biggest thing that confronts us at the moment. And if we can personally experience the transition through a car and changing our habits and changing what we do, we can get our head around the fact that people in their brilliance and in their billions can actually address everything.
Yeah, look, and goes back to culture and language and adoption. We think about barbecue stories. The old barbecue stories last decade were, I've just put a solar panel on my roof. You should get one too. And the new barbecue story is, I just got an electric car. You should get one too. So we're already comfortable with the notion that we can do stuff that's worthy of a barbecue story, that's worthy of a conversation with your mates, that actually you can brag about how much money it saves. And I've got one mate in particular who absolutely loves his new solar panel and battery array, and I get some feedback on it most days, and I'm happy with that, because he's epitomising that translation of culture. He doesn't yet have an electric car because he's got a fairly large beast, and so when we win the argument with him is when do we deliver the practical solution that he wants. He wants a large vehicle that'll tow his caravan. Do we have that in 2022? No, we don't. Is that a concern? No, not really. By 2024 we will, and by 2024 we won't have one, but we'll have a dozen options for large vehicles that are capable of towing. But that's not the end of the story, because let's talk about the future and what things look like. Currently we have a large engine that tows a trailer because you don't put a large engine into your trailer or into your caravan. But actually electric motors are tiny little motors. They're not great big engines. Engine and a motor are two different things. And the motors can go on each wheel of the device, of the motor car. Actually the motors can go onto the wheel of the caravan or the trailer. And the battery load that it needs to actually power itself forward doesn't have to be on the car. It can be on the trailer or the caravan. We're just starting to see these devices become available in Europe. Early days, first one really created in 2019, but there's a few out there now, really not catching everybody's imagination yet. But when the trailer doesn't draw energy from the motor vehicle, nor does it actually draw to the energy in the sense that it doesn't actually reduce the range of the motor vehicle, but rather it's complementary to the range of the motor vehicle, and it's got its own range, and you tow it, and when you actually brake, your car recharges, but when you actually brake, so does your caravan. or your trailer. And that will be true whether it's a camping situation or whether it's a prime mover with a dolly with a double B on it, and they'll be recharging it. They'll have electric motors on the trailer as well, and they'll have them because electric motors are really cheap. Electric motors are just something lifted out of your washing machine. If the kids are listening, go in. You can get 2 electric motors out of your washing machine and your dryer. Off you go. Don't tell mum. And off you go. You've got an electric motor there, and it's really cheap. Electric motors are really cheap. The batteries are the dear part. The price of those is coming down. And when we start getting really cheap batteries, the things that we'll stick batteries into haven't even been imagined yet. We're going into mobile phones as a competitive source for batteries to be utilised, but batteries in mobile phones really started to, cell phones really in the 90s in a big way. That started to develop battery technology. They got even further enhanced when we got to smartphones because we needed slightly bigger batteries, but they didn't need to be bigger in a bigger sense. They just a storage sense. And then by the time we hit last decade, electric car makers thought, those batteries will work for us. We've taken mobile phone batteries in a sense and said, let's whack them into a car, and we've got lots of mobile phone. They're actually double A cell battery size, but it's same. And when we get even further down the path, we'll actually have a whole pile of these batteries that are now really cheap because we're making lots of electric cars, and so we're making lots of batteries. And every time you increase volume and scale for manufacturing, there's a thing called Wright's Law. And this is another thing that populates my model. Wright's Law says every time you double manufacturing of something, whether it's a TV set or whether it's a solar panel or whether it's a mobile phone or it's a motor car, every time you double manufacturing, you bring down costs. Yes. Because it's a thing called a learning curve, and you actually are better at it, more efficient at it, and it's just a natural outcome of doing more things more often. If you're practicing soccer, you go down the learning curve and you're kicking the goal. You practice 10,000 times. If you're playing footy, you're playing tennis, and you do it practice your serving 10,000 times. You're going to be better off. That's a magic number, 10,000. We do that with any manufacturing, and we get cheaper. And over time, the price of that thing, whatever you're producing, gets cheaper. And that absolutely applies to batteries. And batteries are becoming so cheap because we're not just doubling production, but we're quadrupling and quintupling production of batteries over time, so that the learning curve is very, very steep and the price is coming down very quickly.
And that's, we should probably wind up, but that's a great place to wind up in terms of why you're optimistic, why you think humans who are very clever and can bend the entire atmosphere and the planet to their will can also solve these problems and move on. Not without a bit of pain, because change is interesting, but we can do it.
Yeah, the best time to start climate action was in 1988. Mm-hmm. The second best time was in Kyoto in 1998. Next best time was in Copenhagen in 2008. We managed to do something with Paris, but even that's still a bit behind. We really needed to start in 2020. Mm-hmm. 2022 is not quite so bad. Things will be less awful if we start now. I'm optimistic things will be less awful if we start now.
Ray Wills, it's been fantastic talking to you. We'll check up in 2024.
Yeah, watch this space.
2025 maybe.
Yeah.
It'll be a completely different conversation.
It should be.
And we can talk about recycling all of those batteries and the old clunkers.
Yeah, which is also something that I can speak for hours underwater about. So, and certainly, I'll just add this. It's a different thing about the lithium industry than industries before it, mining industries before it, because they are thinking product custodianship. They are thinking about cradle to cradle management of the products that they're producing out of the ground, and lithium miners are very commonly extraordinarily active in the discussion about recycling.
And the kids who grew up, as we talked about before the podcast, the kids who grew up learning about that in grade 3 and doing recycling projects in kindy are the guys in charge and the girls in charge now, and that's why that fundamental cultural shift's happened.
And there's only more of those coming because we've continued to that education program through generations.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for spending time with us.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining and listening with us. let us know if there are people out there who are interesting who you want us to talk to, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.